Hello friendos, I painstakingly looked through all of the options so you don't have to, saving you the boring work. And in this video, I'm going to go through my personal favorites that you should definitely consider looking into to improve your overall experience with Monster Hunter Wilds. With that said, let's just get into it. First we'll bring up the menu, we'll head to system, and then we'll go to options here, and we will begin with game settings, and starting with damage numbers. Now by default this will be whole values only. I personally like to change this to decimals because I like to know all the damage that I'm getting. And we all know the more numbers on your screen, the more dopamine you'll receive. So overall, I like this setting on. The next option we will look into is minimap rotation, angle, and detailed map rotation. Now, I believe by default, these are all on rotation, but I personally like to have them on fixed for two reasons. One, it helps with orientation. And two, if you ever need to look into something on Google or YouTube about a location of endemic life or fishing spots or treasure locations, whatever it is, usually those guides or videos will have their camera on fixed, and that'll make it easier to compare your map with their map because this will never change. It'll always be like this. You won't have this desert over here suddenly to the north of your map. It will always be in this configuration, and that'll make comparing with other players really easy. It also just helps with orientation. When I was playing the beta, I couldn't figure out how to change this, and sometimes the desert would be over here, sometimes the desert would be over here, and it really just confused me because I thought like the desert was just moving every time I opened up my map, but in reality it's just because the map rotates. Obviously I'm not that dumb, but like it's just annoying and it really disoriented me. So personally I would definitely recommend to have these on fixed. Same in the minimap. The next option is resource displays, so that includes the health, stamina, sharpness, and companion health gauges. Personally, I like to have these fixed. You can have them dynamic, so instead of just seeing all of your health, sharpness, whatever, you'll just see a little display instead. Now, again, this is very much personal preference, but I don't really care for that dynamicness, and I just always like to know exactly where my health and sharpness is at every moment of the hunt. So what it means by dynamic is usually it will change your health bar to be a full display during combat, and when you go out of combat, so a monster runs away to another zone, it will change to dynamic, and I just don't like this. When I'm in the middle of a hunt, I always want to know how much health I have and how much sharpness I have, so I like to just have these on fixed. Again, mostly personal preference, but yeah. The next option is in page 3, and it is obscured hunter visibility. This one is really good in my opinion. So by default, your hunter will have a white outline when they are obscured by a monster, and you can kind of see still where your character is, but personally when it comes to outlines, having a white or black outline just isn't visually good for me. So I like to change them to one of these colors. You can change it to either a yellow outline, a red outline, or a blue outline. I'm trying blue for a bit, and I might change it to red or yellow at some point. But I think overall these are really good settings to have rather than black or white. It's just a lot easier to see color than it is to see a shade. And I think not enough people have really looked into this option, so here it is. I'm pointing out you can choose any of these 3 colors and just do whichever one works for you. Maybe white is fine by you, but personally I really struggled with white. I could not see my own character. Next we have Seikret Auto-explore. Now turn this off. We'll go into Seikret Controls a bit later, so I'll explain it then, but for now just turn this setting off. You don't want it on. Our last option in the game settings is weapon attack power display. Now this is somewhat personal preference, but in my opinion it's just best to have coefficients off. If you have them on, you'll have stuff like great swords and hammers doing damage in the thousands, while sword and shield and dual blades will only be doing damage in like the 200s. And this is just inflation. Like, it really doesn't matter. You don't want to see these coefficients because you just want to treat this game like your weapons have weapon damage, and weapon damage should be the same across all rarities, no matter the weapon type. And it just makes comparing things a lot easier when you're making builds or when you're trying to make your Artian weapons when it +5s your damage. It's just a lot better to have coefficients off, in my opinion. They just really aren't helpful at all. They just make your number bigger for no reason other than, oh, me have greatsword, me have bigger number, when in reality that really isn't true, because sword and shields can do more damage than greatswords in some cases. So honestly, turn this off, in my opinion. When you're making builds, comparing damage, it doesn't help to have coefficients on. Next up, we're going to head over to controls here, and the first option that I want to go into is the Slinger Auto-load. Now this is personal preference, but what really annoyed me is when I was going through my radial menu or whatever, I would accidentally auto-load my Slinger with like a paintball pod or anything like that, and it was just annoying because suddenly my flash pod wasn't loaded anymore, and that's annoying. So what I do is have this setting on the do not auto-load, which means when you are going through your radial menu or your item bar or whatever, it won't just automatically load it when you're hovering over it for like a second, and instead you'll have to press, for me it's E on the keyboard. For controller, I believe this is square on PlayStation controller and X on Xbox controllers, but personally I don't like auto load on. I think you'll save yourself a lot of hassle with this turned off, and you'll just be in a bit more control over the buttons you press with having this option on do not auto load. The next option is for focus mode, and it is switching between having it be a hold down or a toggle. Now I'm keyboard and mouse, so I can choose between the two because of the amount of keybinds that I have. Personally, I like to have this as a toggle, but this is complete personal preference, but I do just want to highlight this because not enough people look into this kind of stuff and will just complain that they can't toggle their focus mode when you can. You just need to go into the settings here in page 2 in controls, and you need to just enable this so it will be a toggle rather than a hold. And it is a separate option for ranged as well, so if you want to toggle or hold it for ranged, you can do. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. Personally, I prefer toggle, and if I was to play in controller, then I would definitely have this toggled. Next up is Seikret Controls. Call Seikret Controls. This one is complete personal preference. You'll see again, this is keyboard and mouse controls, but you can either have it where you press a button to call your Seikret, or you hold down a button to call your Seikret, and it will either be an auto move mode or manual move mode. Personally, I just like type 1 because it gives me more options. Then you have Call Seikret Controls through the radial menu. Again, I like manual movement. I don't like my Seikret to auto move unless I specifically want it to auto move. And then these are the two most important things, this in Seikret manual controls and Seikret only route controls. I believe by default these are both on type 1. Honestly, you want to turn these on to type 2. If you turn these on to type 2, your Seikret will no longer just constantly auto move when you want to stop by a hub or whatever, or you just want to stop moving for a moment, but your Seikret keeps moving forward. By turning both of these to type 2, you won't have that problem anymore. When you're tracking down a monster and you're following it, for me, I just need to press tab to track it and Q if I want to stop tracking it, and then as long as I move, and if I move during that point when I've already pressed Q to untoggle the tracking, then it will not track me to that monster anymore, and I can freely move around. And if I press tab again, it'll track me to the monster. Same with controller. I believe it's up on the D-pad to track and down on the D-pad to untrack. And these two options will just give you a lot more freedom of how you're controlling your Seikret. If you don't like the whole auto moving of the Seikret, definitely look into turning these options to type 2 rather than type 1. Next, we're going to go into camera settings here, and we are going to go to page 2. And the first one I want to look at is camera distance zoom. You can change this to be really close to your hunter or really far away from your hunter. This is somewhat personal preference, but having your camera fully zoomed out will give you an easier time against those bigger monsters because you'll be able to fit them more onto the screen. But this is, again, personal preference. If you don't really care too much for that, you can keep it at the default, or you can get really zoomed in. I wouldn't recommend that, or you can be really zoomed out. I really wish there was a way to easily toggle this rather than having to go into the settings, but it is what it is. The last option that I want to go into is the focus camera mode here. This by default will be enabled, which means the moment you find a monster, you will be automatically locked onto the monster and your camera will just center around this monster, which is really annoying. Now, to lock onto a monster with keyboard and mouse, you need to press B, and then to untoggle this, you need to press Control. On controller, you press in the right stick to lock onto a monster, and you tap LB to enable and disable the lock on. Now, having this disabled will just mean that instead of just forcing your camera to lock on the moment you encounter a monster, it'll instead just serve as an auto center to monster button that you can press on demand. So you can be locked onto the monster, and on keyboard and mouse I can press Control and it'll just center my camera to the monster rather than constantly following the monster, which in my opinion is a lot better. It gives you more control over your camera again, and the lock on is just really not good in Monster Hunter. It's really bad. Do not use it. It's going to probably ruin your experience quite a bit. So yeah, I'd personally have this on disable. Just gives you a lot more control over what you're doing. And when you're playing this game, you should definitely learn to control your camera yourself and not rely on this, because it's just not good. Anyway, I said that's the last option, but there's one more, so I did kind of lie, and it's in graphics settings. I don't know about console here, but if you go to the last page in graphics settings, you have motion blur here. You want to turn that shit off. Honestly, nobody likes motion blur. This just gives you motion sickness. It's not a good setting. I don't know why this shit is on by default for every single game you play, but it's awful. It's terrible. Turn this off. You'll thank me later. But yeah, that's all the options that I personally find really helpful to look into. If you do have any options you think I missed, then just leave it in the comments below, and I'd love to hear it, because maybe I'll learn something new. But I think I've been through pretty much all of these that I find interesting. But anyway, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to do all the YouTube shenanigan things, and I will see you in the next one. There's plenty of more Monster Hunter content to come, but in the meantime, take it easy and goodbye.